Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's no small feat for Newfoundland and Labrador to seize the country's attention, the national spotlight. It's no small feat to turn the eyes of all of Canada to the easternmost province, even though we're the youngest province, Mr. Speaker, the coolest province, the most beautiful province. It's no small feat for our issues, for our agenda, to capture the national or the international stage. It's no small feat because we're a small province with just over 500,000 people, about the size of Hamilton, Ontario, Mr. Speaker, or Quebec City. And, Mr. Speaker, we only have 7 members of Parliament. 7 members of Parliament out of what will soon be 338 members of Parliament across the country. So how do we do it, Mr. Speaker? We do it with flair, Newfoundland and Labrador flair. We do it with confidence, a confidence that comes from incredible pride of place. We do it with drive, we do it with determination, we do it with fight, Mr. Speaker. And it is always a fight for Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. We're always having to punch above our weight. Former federal Liberal Cabinet Minister Brian Tobin, now he seized the country's attention, the world's attention, by firing a shot across the bow of a Spanish trawler during the turbulent wars of the 1990s. Tobin then took a 16-story long illegal net with undersized mesh that the Spanish trawler had been dragging on the floor of the Grand Banks. Undersized mesh, so small, Mr. Speaker, that it could catch fish the size of your palm. He took that net and he hung it from a crane on the New York City waterfront near the United Nations. Point taken, Mr. Speaker. Although this is the 20th anniversary of the turbot war, Mr. Speaker, and our fisheries are still in shambles, the industry remains in perpetual crisis. Not much came out of Tobin's theatrics, Mr. Speaker, besides theatrics. Oh, and the premiership, Mr. Speaker. Another former Premier, Danny Williams, he made another point, another national statement, Mr. Speaker, when he removed Canadian flags from the front of all provincial government buildings back in the year 2004. The move turned heads across the country. There were gasps of outrage from one coast to the next coast to the next. Danny removed the maple leafs in retaliation for the actions of this Conservative Prime Minister. The Prime Minister reneged on a promise to honor a deal excluding offshore resource revenues, oil revenues, from the equalization formula. And Danny Williams, Mr. Speaker, Danny Williams went to war. He accused the Prime Minister of betraying Newfoundland and Labrador. He called the Prime Minister a fraud. He questioned the Prime Minister's character, and he said, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister cannot be trusted. Danny Williams launched the ABC campaign, anybody but Conservative, during the 2008 federal election, and not a single Conservative MP, not one, Mr. Speaker, was elected from Newfoundland and Labrador. There are times, Mr. Speaker, there are times that we don't feel like, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we don't feel like we belong, we're welcome in this confederation, Mr. Speaker. Again, there are times we feel like we're not welcome. There are times when we feel that we're not important, that we're expendable even, not high on the national agenda, which brings us to today, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is accused, yet again, of betraying Newfoundland and Labrador, of betraying the progressive Conservative government of Newfoundland and Labrador, of reneging on a deal, Mr. Speaker, of a double cross, of breaking a promise, of failing to honor an agreement. It certainly looks that way, Mr. Speaker. The facts point in the betrayal direction. And that seems to be a trend with this Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. The same Prime Minister who once said that Atlantic Canada has a culture of defeat. Mr. Speaker, the actions of this Prime Minister towards Newfoundland and Labrador, to put it mildly, they do not foster warmth, they do not foster trust. The Conservative brand, the federal Conservative brand back home, Mr. Speaker, is dirt. The Prime Minister's surname is almost a swear word. It's a bad word, Mr. Speaker. You don't repeat it in public. But there's still time for him, there's still time for this Prime Minister and his government, Mr. Speaker, to do the right thing. there's still time for him to do the right thing by Newfoundland and Labrador for a change. There's still time for this Prime Minister to keep his word to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. More than that, Mr. Speaker. There's time for the Prime Minister to help position Newfoundland and Labrador for the elusive success with our fisheries. There's still time for this Prime Minister to surrender his defeatist attitude towards Atlantic Canada. Mr. Speaker, this motion centers around the Canada-European Union Free Trade Deal, CETA, the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement. Unlike any other province, Mr. Speaker, Newfoundland and Labrador was asked to give something up, was asked by this Conservative government to surrender its most fundamental fisheries policy to make the trade deal happen. This Conservative government asked my province to surrender what's called minimum processing requirements. Those requirements protect fish plant jobs on land by ensuring that fish caught off our shores is processed in fish plants on our shores. Minimum processing requirements. Mr. Speaker, the Newfoundland and Labrador government thought long and hard about what it wanted in exchange for surrendering those minimum processing requirements. And this Conservative government asked the province, asked Newfoundland and Labrador to think outside the box. In the end, Mr. Speaker, the two levels of government decided to create a $400 million fisheries investment fund. $280 million was to come from this Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, and the remaining $120 million was to come from the provincial government, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Mr. Speaker, correspondence from this government clearly outlines that the Fisheries Fund was for a transitional program to address development and renewal in the seafood industry. This motion, the opposition motion before this House today, Mr. Speaker, calls on the Conservative government to respect, calls on the Conservative government to honor its commitment to Newfoundland and Labrador, a deal that was first struck in June of 2013. There was no gray area, Mr. Speaker. This was clearly, it was clearly a deal between two levels of government. Former progressive Conservative Premier Cathy Dunderdale, she held a news conference in October 2013, Mr. Speaker. She held that news conference to announce details of the agreement that it had struck with the federal Conservative government. And this government, Mr. Speaker, it did not say a peep about the agreement, about the $400 million fisheries fund. It did not raise a single objection, Mr. Speaker, not one. Not one word was said, Mr. Speaker, in objection to anything announced by the Newfoundland and Labrador government for 17 months. 17 months, Mr. Speaker. 17 months for this Conservative government to raise a single objection to any of the points announced by the Newfoundland and Labrador government, the progressive, conservative government of Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. And there wasn't a word. There wasn't a whisper. I even posed a question on the order paper last April, Mr. Speaker, that asked the President of the Treasury Board for details of the Fisheries Fund, including the purpose and any stipulations on the funding. In response, the Treasury Board President refused to answer, applying the Privacy Act on the grounds that the information is, quote, confidence of cabinet. Mr. Speaker, I clearly asked if there were stipulations on the funding, and the Conservatives refused to answer. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why did they do that? Why did they wait almost a year and a half to raise a single objection, a whisper of objection to the details announced by the Newfoundland and Labrador government? Why did they wait almost a year and a half to change the terms of the deal? Was it to keep Newfoundland and Labrador quiet, Mr. Speaker? Was it to shut up the province until the CETA deal was done? Because it certainly appears that way, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives now say that the Fisheries Fund was only created to compensate for losses from the removal of minimum processing requirements. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the province must now show direct losses before it's compensated from the Fisheries Fund. But that wasn't the deal, Mr. Speaker. That's an excuse. I see that, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister essentially giving Newfoundland and Labrador the finger, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives now say the $280 million, their contribution, is not a blank check. The Minister of Justice even had the gall a few weeks ago to visit St. John's and criticize Newfoundland and Labrador for wanting a, quote, for wanting a slush fund. Now, that's the same minister, Mr. Speaker, who used a military search and rescue helicopter for a taxi from a fishing lodge on the Gander River. That minister, Mr. Speaker, he has no credibility. I had another Conservative, Mr. Speaker, who told me the province was after yet another handout, a welfare check, Mr. Speaker. He said that to my face. He only said it once, Mr. Speaker. He was wrong. He was dead wrong. We want the ability to stand on our own. We want to do for ourselves. We want the ability to do for ourselves, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the $400 million fisheries fund is for compensation for losses as a result of CETA, why is the province of Newfoundland and Labrador kicking in $120 million of its own money? To compensate itself, Mr. Speaker? That makes no sense. Mr. Speaker, why was ACOA tasked with administering the fund? If the $400 million was straight-up compensation, why go through ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, Mr. Speaker? Pay the province, pay the companies directly. And another point, Mr. Speaker. It could be another 5 or so years before minimum processing requirements are officially eliminated as part of CETA. Now, according to Conservative rationale, that means 5 years before Newfoundland and Labrador would receive any funds to help it with the marketing and development needed to capitalize on the 500 million person EU market. Again, Mr. Speaker, that makes no sense. It is not smart. It does not add up. The transition fund was for us to capitalize on the EU trade deal. It was to position ourselves, to position the fishery for renewal, for maximum benefit. We can't do that with this Conservative double-cross, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the former Progressive Conservative government of Cathy Dunderdale held a news conference in 2013, I mentioned that earlier, to announce the deal with the federal Conservatives, the elimination of minimum processing requirements for a $400 million fisheries fund. The PCs were criticized because there were no federal Conservatives in the room. At the same time, the federal Conservatives held a Canada-EU summit reception in September past. They spent more than $160,000 on that reception, Mr. Speaker, when the final trade deal has yet to be ratified by the European Union nations. Mr. Speaker, the deal to surrender minimum processing requirements for a $400 million fisheries fund has been lauded. It's been lauded by all quarters in the Newfoundland and Labrador fishing industry, Mr. Speaker. The union likes it. Industry's on side, and the province, of course, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador is behind it. The most obvious benefit of the trade deal, Mr. Speaker, is duty-free access to the world's most lucrative fish and seafood market, which imports more than $25 billion in products annually. More than $25 billion a year. And we want a piece of that market, Mr. Speaker. Make no mistake, we want a piece of that market. Mr. Speaker, CETA would eliminate 95% of all fish and seafood tariffs when the deal comes into force, with all remaining tariffs going to zero within 3, 5, or 7 years. Now, again, the elimination of tariffs is seen as a good thing, as a great thing for a fishing industry. Everybody is in favor, Mr. Speaker. All sides. But there are still voices of concern, Mr. Speaker. There are still voices of concern. There are voices of concern from the offshore oil industry. Concern that oil companies will no longer have to charter Canadian-flagged vessels with Canadian crews. Instead, Mr. Speaker, the concern is that CETA will open up the shipping industry so foreign-flagged vessels could operate in Canadian waters, foreign vessels with much lower working standards and pay and money and salaries than Canadian ships. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, there's concern in some quarters of Newfoundland and Labrador that CETA will allow foreign ownership of Canadian fish quotas. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, that can happen right now. But there's also concern that foreign trawlers with lower-paid foreign fishing crews will be chartered to catch Canadian fish and sail it to the European Union for processing. Now, Mr. Speaker, could there come a day when fish off our shores is not caught, when fish off our shores is not processed by Canadians? Could that day come? Is a question that I have been asked, Mr. Speaker, a concern that has been raised. What is the answer, Mr. Speaker? Could a day come when fish off our shores isn't processed or caught by Canadians? What's the answer? Now, a few words about the Liberals to my left, Mr. Speaker. The CETA deal was barely out of the mouth of the Prime Minister when the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada jumped to his feet in this House to endorse the deal. Now, the Liberal leader, he hadn't read the deal, Mr. Speaker. The wording was not out then. He didn't know the terms for Newfoundland and Labrador either. Mr. Speaker, I ask you this question. Would you buy a car, would you buy a house without reading the contract, without reading the fine print? No, Mr. Speaker. I'll answer for you. No. A person who did that would be irresponsible. But the Liberals here supported the deal without even reading it. Shame, Mr. Speaker. Shame. And now the Liberal leader has written a letter to the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador in support of the $400 million Fisheries Fund. That's all well and good, Mr. Speaker. Newfoundland and Labrador is being nailed to the wall, and the Liberal leader blindly trusted the Prime Minister. A monster trade deal, and the Liberal leader gave it all of 10 seconds at the most, Mr. Speaker, 10 seconds consideration. Now, as it stands, Mr. Speaker, the collapse in world oil prices is slamming Newfoundland and Labrador from both ends. To the east, revenues from the province's oil play on the Grand Banks are down substantially, to the point that this year's provincial deficit is pegged at $916 million. Now, that's a deficit of almost $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, obviously, for a small province with just over 500,000 people. To the west, thousands of layoffs in Alberta's oil sands will have a devastating impact on our migratory workforce. Thousands of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, Mr. Speaker, traveled west every day, every month, every year for work in the oil sands. Alberta oil money has been propping up our fishing outports for years. The fishery has not returned since the early 1990s when the Northern Cod Moratorium was introduced. The fishery has not returned, not even close to its historic days, because of federal mismanagement. Don't want to leave that out, Mr. Speaker, because of federal mismanagement. Newfoundland and Labrador has been, the problem with the progressive Conservative government is the same problem with the federal Conservative government, Mr. Speaker. It's been focused solely on the oil industry, to our peril. Economic tunnel vision is what I've called it, Mr. Speaker. Diversification is critical. Diversification to renewable resources. Fish, for example, is key. Oil and gas will run out, Mr. Speaker. That is an absolute given. It's a certainty. Fish, if managed properly, for a change, not under this Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, fish, if managed properly and given a chance to reproduce, will be around forever, Mr. Speaker. Now, of all the things I can say about, with absolute certainty, Mr. Speaker, of all the things that I could say about this Prime Minister, I'll say this, Mr. Speaker. He's not stupid. He's not stupid. He's the first person to praise the benefits and opportunity of this latest free trade deal, and so he should. His government is bringing it in, Mr. Speaker. Surely, Mr. Speaker, he can see the direct benefit of Newfoundland and Labrador using the $400 million Fisheries Fund to poise itself, to poise ourselves for tariff-free access to the European Union market, to prepare ourselves in terms of marketing and industry renewal. Newfoundland and Labrador, unlike any other province, is giving up minimum processing requirements. We're surrendering a constitutional right over our greatest industry, our greatest resource. We're the only province asked to surrender anything. My province made a deal in good faith with a Conservative government, a Conservative Prime Minister who has been accused before of betrayal. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Maybe Newfoundland and Labrador should be ashamed of itself, Mr. Speaker, for putting faith in this Conservative government. Again, I'm appealing to the Prime Minister. Surrender, sir, your defeatist attitude towards Atlantic Canada. Surrender your war with Newfoundland and Labrador. Stand by your word. Do the honourable thing. Do the right thing. For Canada, for Newfoundland and Labrador, honour your promise. Stand by your word, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.